A white person who claims self-defense is literally 10 times more likely to be found innocent in a self-defense case than a black person who claims self-defense when the victim is white. This is America. So when I think of Trayvon and that George Zimmerman is still to this day running around somewhere free, and Karmelo is facing prison for almost twice the number of years that he's been on this earth. Yes, it's sad, it's disturbing, it's angering, but it's not surprising. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Fearless Politics. I have to tell you that today is probably going to be the most difficult episode that I've experienced. And that's because this episode is going to hit home in a way that no other episode has. The reality is, I'm a mother of two sons, two little black boys who are now young black men. And I have to say that as a mother, the thing that scared me the most was knowing that one day these boys, these cute little boys that complete strangers would come up to and smile and play with and want to interact with them. The most heartbreaking part of parenting those little boys was I knew that as they grew, as they physically got bigger, that the world would not see them in the way that I saw them. The world would not give them a chance to show their humanity. The world would not give them the opportunity to be perceived as an individual who is intelligent, who is ambitious, who is hardworking, who is kind, who is thoughtful, who is empathetic. I knew that at some point along the way of their development, the same people that were stopping and bending down and smiling at them openly, as they got physically bigger, those same people would be crossing the street to get away from them. Those same people would be closing elevator doors so that they wouldn't have to share space with them. Those same people would see them as danger before seeing them as humans. I worried about not only how I would protect them physically in a nation that has never been safe for Black bodies, but I also worried about how would I prepare them emotionally to deal with an instance that would hurt them to their core because they were being treated in a way that diminished who they were. How could I also save them in situations in which they had a right to defend themselves? And I have never been one of those mothers that said, walk away from altercations. I have been one of those mothers that have always said, you have a right to defend yourself. But in the wake of this Carmelo Anthony case, what's so heartbreaking here is that, yes, you do have a young man who lost his life. But yes, you also have a young man who had the right to defend himself. And I fail to understand how a George Zimmerman can stalk a young Black boy, engage in a physical altercation with him that he started, pull out a gun, shoot him dead, and then be found innocent because somehow he was given a right to defend himself. But the same nation says that a young Black boy who had the right to be where he was during his track meet, who was surrounded by hostile individuals, who was physically touched in a threatening way at minimum by one of those individuals, how is it that that person does not have the right to defend himself? The reality is he does not have that right in practice, not because of who he is as a young Black boy, but as who we are as a nation. I would like to say that I was shocked with the Carmelo Anthony ruling, but the reality is I was not. The reality is I expected it. The reality is I took into consideration that number one, this is Texas, and he's Black, and the victim is white. And I took into consideration that every Black person that was in the jury pool was summarily dismissed, leaving a jury without even one Black person on it. Honestly, the minute that I knew the makeup of the jury was the minute that I knew what the verdict would be. I find it hard to believe that a young man that has a 3.7 GPA, that was responsible enough to be voted captain of 2 sports teams that he participated in, both his football and track teams, that a young man that held 2 jobs, that a young man who reportedly saved the life of a drowning child when he was only 14 years old, that a young man that did not have a criminal record. I found it hard to believe that someone that had displayed that level of character, ambition, kindness, courage, that someone like that would just wake up one day and premeditate murder, knowingly put himself in a situation in which he would intentionally kill someone. I found that difficult to believe. And so I held out hope that at least he might be found guilty of manslaughter instead of murder. But then the reality is, this is America. I know the history of this nation. I also know the statistics around this because you know I like to pull the receipts. And here's what we know. According to a study by the Urban Institute that looked at self-defense cases across the racial dynamic, there is a huge difference, big shocker, between the likelihood that a white person who claims self-defense when the victim is Black will be found innocent versus when a Black person who claims self-defense is found innocent when the victim is white. Huge difference. In fact, 10 times difference, okay? A white person who claims self-defense is literally 10 times more likely to be found innocent in a self-defense case than a Black person who claims self-defense when the victim is white. This is America. So when I think of Trayvon and that George Zimmerman is still to this day running around somewhere free, and Karmelo is facing prison for almost twice the number of years that he's been on this earth. Yes, it's sad, it's disturbing, it's angering, but it's not surprising. I will say that there is one bit of good news I could share with you today, and that is the fact that his team has already put in for an appeal We will see what will happen with that appeal. But the reality is, according to Texas law, he has to serve at least half of his sentence before he has the opportunity to come up for parole. And so this young man was 17 when this happened. It'll be 17 years in prison if the appeal does not go his way before he's even given the opportunity to go home. Here's the reality. As disturbing as that is, that's not the only disturbing thing I have to share with you this week. This week, we took another loss when it came to the voting rights drama, the voting rights destruction that we as a community are facing right now. So you remember last week I was talking about a particular win having to do with Alabama. And in Alabama, I shared that the federal courts had found the state's new maps to be outright racially discriminatory. And I can specifically quote to you a bit of what that ruling found. That ruling found, and I quote, "There's no other way to understand this except for racial intent. Alabama's plan was tainted by intentional race-based discrimination, and the legislature attempted to rob Black Alabamians of an equal opportunity under the law to elect candidates of their choice." And let me focus on that for a minute. This specific statement about the legislature attempting to rob Black Alabamians of an equal opportunity under the law to elect candidates of their choice. This right here is critical because if I hear one more ignoramus say, well, you can still vote, that's not what we're talking about. Do you have the opportunity to vote for the candidate of your choice? What they have done here is attacked our voting power. It's meant to dilute our voting power. It's meant to create a situation where the options that you have on the ballot do not include people that have your interest in mind. It's meant to undermine your ability to vote for the candidate of your choice. And as Black people, we have been specifically targeted by this to a degree that the federal appeals court, dominated by Trump appointees, has said, hell yeah, this is racist. Well, what happened last week was the Supreme Court went back and completely overruled that ruling. And what's even more disturbing is not only did they rule against it, it's the way they ruled against it, their justification for ruling against it. This justification is even worse than the original ruling, if you ask me, because this justification made even more clear that we don't really give a damn if there was racist intent in putting together these districts. We really don't give a damn at all, okay? As long as you provide a political pretext. Guess what? What the court has essentially done here is invented a right to discriminate. As long as there's partisan pretext, they are saying that these states have a right to discriminate. And here's the thing. Where is that in the Constitution? If anything, the Constitution has something called an equal protection clause. It's supposed to protect you from discrimination. But no, the court is saying, nah, you have a right to discriminate, lawmakers, when you're putting together these districts. This is devastating to our ability to vote for the person of our choice as a community, particularly within the South. So here is a challenge that I want to give the Democratic Party. There is enough additional districts that can be taken in California. That one state can counteract the districts that have been taken away from Black legislators in the South. That needs to be on. New York needs to get in the game. Virginia needs to come back even stronger next time. Two can play at that game. And I have to say, because blue states have larger populations than red states, there is more wiggle room to gain in the Democratic states. And so the Democratic Party needs to stop playing so conservatively, no pun intended, when it comes to this. Once again, you have the Republicans who are being ruthless. The Democrats need to understand how to be ruthless in return, number one. But most importantly, Black people have fought too long, too hard, have lost too many lives to have our voting power diluted in this way without fighting back. And here's the thing that we need to understand. Even though this is now yesterday's news on mainstream media, you never see it talked about anymore. You rarely see it written about anymore in the mainstream spaces. I want you to understand that what happened with this latest ruling by the Supreme Court may even be more dangerous than the original interpretation of Calais in the first place, because they have explicitly said racist intent be damned. Okay, we don't care if it's racist. You can go ahead anyway, as long as you have some partisan reason for what you're doing. What does that open the door to? This interpretation could potentially go beyond voting. What if someone would say, well, if the 14th Amendment is basically now being interpreted as you actually have the right to discriminate as long as you have an appropriate reason for discrimination, why is that going to be limited then to voting? Perhaps, maybe perhaps it could be expanded to other things. Maybe this is just the beginning of the complete destruction of civil rights protections in this nation. Maybe this means that this logic can be applied in areas that will say, hey, you could discriminate when it comes to access to education. You could discriminate when it comes to access to mortgages, to any other type of loan that you might need, car loans, whatever. You can discriminate when it comes to employment, housing, all of these different areas of life that we have taken for granted for the past 50 plus years, that we would have some protection under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Maybe this is the destruction of the very undergirding of the idea that discrimination is illegal in this nation. Now, you might be thinking I'm being dramatic when I say that. And I have to tell you, I am not. I am not. How do I know that I'm not being dramatic? Because this week we've already had the Department of Justice test that theory. The DOJ put out a legal opinion that accused the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission of itself being in violation of federal civil rights laws because, according to the DOJ, disparate impact is itself unconstitutional. Now, that is huge. Let me explain to you what that means. All right. So, disparate impact has typically been the way in which those individuals who are claiming discrimination by their employer have been able to prove it. And disparate impact is a legal theory that says if the impact of an action causes outcomes that show discrimination, then that is all you have to do to prove that discrimination has indeed occurred. Similar to how, for example, the federal court ruling in the Alabama case said, meaning that clearly there's a racist impact here. It's a racist impact. And as a result, this is an example of discrimination. The Department of Justice have seemingly used that very same logic to say that using disparate impact when it relates to employment discrimination is itself unconstitutional. Now, does the DOJ have the right to claim anything unconstitutional? Held to the no. They are not judges. They are not members of the Supreme Court. They're not even members of the federal court. They are not judges. They can't deem things constitutional and unconstitutional. So the fact that they have gone out of their way to do this suggests that what we are about to see is going to be the complete destruction of anti-discrimination protections that we have relied on in this country for decades through the EEOC, through the Equal Opportunity Commission. It is going to be that much harder for anyone who has experienced discrimination in the workplace to be able to now prove it if this Department of Justice is now saying that disparate impact is quote unquote unconstitutional. Absolutely ridiculous. But is it surprising? This is the same Department of Justice that has already come out to say, we only want to examine discrimination cases if those discrimination cases are on behalf of white men. We know who you are. We know what you are. We see what you are doing. What this will mean in practice is that if you are facing discrimination in employment, you are going to have to show intent. You're going to have to prove the specific intent of the person or the organization to discriminate against you, which is a much higher bar than showing disparate impact. You're going to have to be able to read people's minds or somehow be able to capture people on film saying that, hey, I mean to discriminate against this person, which we understand that in this society, most people are not going to say that out loud, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It doesn't mean that it's not real, and it doesn't mean that the impact is not significant. So let's look at this from the big picture lens then. What does this mean for all of us? It means that this is the tip of the iceberg. This ruling in Calais does not just mean the dilution of voting power for Black people throughout the South. It does not just mean a full frontal attack on Black political representation. This really is the beginning of the end of civil rights protections for people of all protected classes, for everyone in America, honestly, except for white men who apparently this administration has said, you can do no wrong. You belong to be in places that you're clearly not qualified for. You deserve everything that you want. And if you don't, then come to us at the Department of Justice and we will say that you were discriminated against. Okay. If you are not a straight white male, we are at the beginning of the end of civil rights protections in this nation. I say all that to say we need to start taking this seriously. This is a 5-alarm fire. It will not stop with voting rights. It will not stop with discrimination in the workplace. It will not stop at any of these things. And the only way that we can stop them is to at least slow this down in November. But you know what? We're built for this. With that said, I'll see you again next week for another episode of Fearless Politics. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Fearless Politics. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe, follow, and leave that 5-star rating that you and I both know we deserve. Also, feel free to leave a review so more people can find out about us and become members of the Fearless Politics crew. And finally, if you want to go further down the rabbit hole with us, then be sure to check us out at fearlesspoliticspodcast.com or connect with me personally on Instagram at fearless.Dr. With that said, we'll see you next time. And don't forget, it's time to be fearless. See you soon.